That concludes questions for oral answer. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill. Interrupted debate on third reading.
Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased to take my final call on this piece of legislation that we've put through. That this is a piece of legislation that has gone through this House relatively quickly. It was only introduced a short time ago and it's worked its way through the Select Committee process, and Labor is supporting this legislation as we have indicated at previous readings, Mr Speaker. The reason why we're supporting this legislation is that simply we had to, because this is a fix-up of a fix-up of a fix-up of a blunder by Nick Smith. This is a fix-up of a piece of legislation that we shouldn't be using this House time to debate. It is a fix-up piece of legislation that could have been anticipated. So, Mr Speaker, let me take you through the various things in which this legislation does, in case people over the few days we've had away from this House, Mr Speaker, may have lost sight of the important things.
I'm sorry to interrupt the member. Could I ask those who are leaving to do so, please, in a timely manner? It's important that we hear what the Speaker is saying, and I'm asking Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So what this bill does is it amends Section 162 of the Exclusive Economic Zone legislation. In effect, what that does is allows the Maui gas platform to continue operating. It has just recently, only in the last week or so, or couple of weeks, Mr Speaker, had its consent approved. But what the original principal legislation of the EEZ did not do was put a transitional arrangement in place to allow the existing operators, of which there are only 4, Mr Speaker, to come inside the new regulatory regime. So we were faced with the very real prospect at the beginning of this year of a piece of shoddy legislation from Nick Smith that did not allow for the existing operators to come in, and the really real possibility that we would have had to have seen the Maui gas platform shut down while this was worked through. All of this entirely predictable, Mr Speaker. But what has also been entirely predictable is the passage of this legislation in the House. This is not the first time, as we've talked about in previous contributions, that we've been in this House paying fix-up to the fix-up to the fix-up legislation on this. In fact, when the principal legislation was first brought to the House and sent to Select Committee, it took an entire rewrite by the Select Committee to get that legislation in any kind of shape. It had to come back to the House with something like 14 pages of ministerial SOP in order to make it fit for purpose and do what it purported to do. But, Mr Speaker, with only a very short time frame, that in the last Parliament we were back in this House playing patch-up to that legislation. And here we are again. But what is even more disturbing, Mr Speaker, is that this bill that was introduced to the House and sent off to Select Committee, when it got there, had some fundamental flaws with it too. And Mr Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the hard work of the Select Committee. I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Select Committee Chair Sock Simpson. But above all, Mr Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the submitters on this bill. Because it was the submitters on this bill that have meant that we're not going to be back here in a week or a month or 2 or 3 months playing fix-up to the fix-up to the fix-up to the fix-up legislation on another Nick Smith blunder. Because what the original legislation that Nick Smith tabled in the House did was leave things entirely open-ended. That we were putting in place transitional arrangements to bring only 4 operators into a regulatory regime, Maui's gas platform, whose consent expires at the end of June of this year. But the 4th and final of these operators, their ability to operate under the environment that existed before the passage of the EEZ does not run out to 2032. And what the initial legislation that was tabled did was offer an open-ended timeframe to those operators. There was no onus of when it was that they needed to have their consents in by. And this is the standard of work we have had from this government on this piece of legislation. Because what this legislation does, Mr Speaker, is it creates a bypass for the existing operators to say, okay, you were operating under the Crown Minerals Act and various other pieces of legislation prior to the passage of the EEZ legislation. What we'll do is we'll create a way for you to come in to the new regulatory regime. You need to have your consent in place and you need to transition in. But Mr Speaker, it was only the work of the Select Committee and only the very fine submissions that we heard from a number of submitters that pointed out that the legislation that we had in front of us put absolutely no parameters around when it was that one of those operators had to have their consent filed by. So we were faced with the really real prospect of consent holders whose consent expires in 2032, quite some time away, when there's not a real rush and an urgency isn't there around the time frame. We were faced with the prospect, Mr Speaker, of those operators being able to not put their consent application in till the day that their consent expired or even before. But what the work of the Select Committee did is that we looked at three options, 6, 9 and 12 months for when it was that an operator, what is a reasonable time frame for one of these existing operators to have applied for a consent. And we went through a range of options and looked for alignment with other legislation. And we settled on 9 months because not only did it align well with other pieces of legislation in this space, but also it was also practically around the amount of time in which it will take for a consent to be processed. Because, Mr Speaker, it's not only the consent being processed, of course, that the consent being processed is one part of it. What was putting Maui platform really at risk was the spectre that we may indeed have appeals to that and that that operator would not be able to operate while those appeals are heard. So what this legislation does, it brings it far more into line with what we see under the RMA, although there's not total alignment, but it has brought it far more under alignment with that. So, Mr Speaker, it is of concern to us that there was a lucky catch from the Select Committee on more ministerial incompetence from Nick Smith, that through his office a piece of legislation like that could land on the table of this House and then could be sent to Select Committee. I know, Mr Speaker, that it is the job of Select Committees to examine legislation, and we did support this legislation at first reading, saying it was a piece of legislation that we wanted to look at very closely when it went to Select Committee. We wanted to look for the fishhooks. But, Mr Speaker, when it comes to putting in place a regulatory regime that is going to govern something that actually could have potentially turned off over 25% of the gas supply for New Zealand, not to mention a number of jobs being put on the line while the appeals were heard, this is not an acceptable standard from a government. What we're seeing is it's yet another example of a government that is failing to meet the needs of ordinary New Zealanders when it is failing in the most fundamental role, that is to table legislation that is fit for purpose and is going to do what it purports to do. It shows a government that is out of touch. It thinks, oh, well, it doesn't really matter that we could see the Maui gas platform closed down. Might be a loss of bit of natural gas. There will be all those people whose jobs are put on the line. It is a distracted government that is making mistakes. It is prone to blunders, and lo and behold, who do we find at the centre of this blunder? The Minister of Blunders himself, Nick Smith. Mr Speaker, it is sloppy that this legislation got to this House in this form. It is a government that it could have literally been the government that was failing to deliver the brighter future when the lights went out because we shut down one of our major energy sources in this country. And that we expect more. But, Mr Speaker, we are supporting supporting this legislation, that this is a problem that does need to be fixed. It is yet another error in an error-prone piece of legislation. We will be supporting it, and once again, I would like to acknowledge the very important role that those submitters played when they came to our select committee, and that they made sure that this was legislation that we didn't have to come back in only a few weeks and fix another Nick Smith blunder. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.